Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible. 2 Kings 8. The passages of story recorded in this chapter oblige us to look back. 1. We read before of a Shenamite woman that was a kind benefactor to Elisha. Now here we are told how she fared the better for it, afterwards, in the advice Elisha gave her, and the favor the king showed her for his sake. Verses 1-6. 2. We read before of the designation of Hazael to be king of Syria, 1 Kings 19 verse 15, and here we have an account of his elevation to that throne and the way he forced for himself to it by killing his master, verses 7-15. 3. We read before of Jehoram's reigning over Judah in the room of his father Jehoshaphat, 1 Kings 22 verse 50, now here we have a short and sad history of his short and wicked reign, verses 16-24. And the beginning of the history of the reign of his son Ahaziah, verses 25-29. A famine in Israel, the Shenamites' possessions restored, 886 BC. 1 Then spake Elisha unto the woman, whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise, and go thou and thine household, and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn, for the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. 2 And the woman arose, and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household, and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. 3 And it came to pass at the 7 years' end, that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth to cry unto the king for her house and for her land. 4 And the king talked with Gehazi the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha hath done. 5 And it came to pass, as he was telling the king how he had restored a dead body to life, that, behold, the woman, whose son he had restored to life, cried to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. 6 And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, Restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field since the day that she left the land, even until now. Here we have 1. The wickedness of Israel punished with a long famine, one of God's sore judgments often threatened in the law. Canaan, that fruitful land, was turned into barrenness, for the iniquity of those that dwelt therein. The famine in Samaria was soon relieved by the raising of that siege, but neither that judgment nor that mercy had a due influence upon them, and therefore the Lord called for another famine, for when he judgeth he will overcome. If less judgments do not prevail to bring men to repentance, he will send greater and longer. They are at his beck, and will come when he calls for them. He does, by his ministers, call for reformation and obedience, and, if those calls be not regarded, we may expect he will call for some plague or other, for he will be heard. This famine continued 7 years, as long again as that in Elijah's time, for if men will walk contrary to him, he will heat the furnace yet hotter. 2. The kindness of the good Shenamite to the prophet rewarded by the care that was taken of her in that famine. She was not indeed fed by miracle, as the widow of Sarepta was, but 1. She had notice given her of this famine before it came, that she might provide accordingly, and was directed to remove to some other country. Anywhere but in Israel she would find plenty. It was a great advantage to Egypt in Joseph's time that they had notice of the famine before it came, so it was to this Shenamite. Others would be forced to remove at last, after they had long borne the grievances of the famine, and had wasted their substance, and could not settle elsewhere upon such good terms as she might that went early, before the crowd, and took her stock with her unbroken. It is our happiness to foresee an evil, and our wisdom, when we foresee it, to hide ourselves. 2. Providence gave her a comfortable settlement in the land of the Philistines, who, though subdued by David, yet were not wholly rooted out. It seems the famine was peculiar to the land of Israel, and other countries that joined close to them had plenty at the same time, which plainly showed the immediate hand of God in it, as in the plagues of Egypt, when they distinguished between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and that the sins of Israel, against whom this judgment was directly leveled, were more provoking to God than the sins of their neighbors, because of their profession of relation to God. You only have I known, therefore will I punish you, Amos 3 verse 2. Other countries had rain when they had none, were free from locusts and caterpillars when they were eaten up with them, for some think this was the famine spoken of, Joel 1 verses 3 and 4. It is strange that when there was plenty in the neighboring countries there were not those that made it their business to import corn into the land of Israel, which might have prevented the inhabitants from removing, but as they were befooled with their idolatries, so they were infatuated even in the matters of their civil interest. 3. Her petition to the king at her return, favored by the seasonableness of her application to him. 1. When the famine was over she returned out of the land of the Philistines. That was no proper place for an Israelite to dwell any longer than there was a necessity for so doing, for there she could not keep her new moons and her Sabbaths as she used to do in her own country, among the schools of the prophets, chapter 4 verse 23. 2. At her return she found herself kept out of the possession of her own estate, it being either confiscated to the exchequer, seized by the Lord, or usurped in her absence by some of the neighbors, or perhaps the person she had entrusted with the management of it proved false, and would neither resign it to her nor come to an account with her for the profits. So hard is it to find a person that one can put a confidence in a time of trouble, Proverbs 25 verse 19, Micah 7 verse 5. 3. She made her application to the king himself for redress, for, it seems, be it observed to his praise, he was easy of access, and did himself take cognizance of the complaint of his injured subjects. Time was when she dwelt so securely among her own people that she had no occasion to be spoken for to the king, or to the captain of the host, chapter 4 verse 13, but now her own familiar friends, in whom she trusted, proved so unjust and unkind that she was glad to appeal to the king against them. Such uncertainty there is in the creature that may fail us which we most depend upon, and that befriend us which we think we shall never need. 4. She found the king talking with Gehazi about Elisha's miracles, verse 4. It was his shame that he needed now to be informed concerning them, when he might have acquainted himself with them, as they were done from Elisha himself, if he had not been willing to shut his eyes against the convincing evidence of his mission. Yet it was his praise that he was now better disposed, and would rather talk with a leper that was capable of giving a good account of them than continue ignorant of them. The law did not forbid all conversation with lepers, but only dwelling with them. There being then no priests in Israel, perhaps the king, or some one appointed by him, had the inspection of lepers, and passed the judgment upon them, which might bring him acquainted with Gehazi. 5. This happy coincidence befriended both Gehazi's narrative and her petition. Providence is to be acknowledged in ordering the circumstances of events, for sometimes those that are minute in themselves prove of great consequence, as this did, for 1. It made the king ready to believe Gehazi's narrative when it was thus confirmed by the persons most nearly concerned, this is the woman, and this her son, let them speak for themselves, verse 5. Thus did God even force him to believe what he might have had some color to question if he had only had Gehazi's word for it, because he was branded for a liar, witness his leprosy. 2. It made him ready to grant her request, for who would not be ready to favor one whom heaven had thus favored, and to support a life which was given once and again by miracle? In consideration of this the king gave orders that her land should be restored to her, and all the profits that were made of it in her absence. If it was to himself that the land and profits had eschewed, it was generous and kind to make so full a restitution. He would not, as Pharaoh did in Joseph's time, enrich the crown by the calamities of his subjects. If it was by some other person that her property was invaded, it was an act of justice in the king, and part of the duty of his place, to give her redress, Psalm 82 verses 3 and 4, Proverbs 31 verse 9. It is not enough for those in authority that they do no wrong themselves, but they must support the right of those that are wronged. Hazael's barbarity predicted, 885 BC. 7 And Elisha came to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad the king of Syria was sick, and it was told him, saying, The man of God is come hither. 8 And the king said unto Hazael, Take a present in thine hand, and go meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, Shall I recover of this disease? 9 So Hazael went to meet him, and took a present with him, even of every good thing of Damascus, 40 camels burdened, and came and stood before him, and said, Thy son Ben-Hadad king of Syria hath sent me to thee, saying, Shall I recover of this disease? 10 And Elisha said unto him, Go, say unto him, Thou mayest certainly recover, howbeit the Lord hath showed me that he shall surely die. 11 And he settled his countenance steadfastly, until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. 12 And Hazael said, Why weepeth my Lord? And he answered, Because I know the evil that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel, their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children, and rip up their women with child. 13 And Hazael said, But what, is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha answered, The Lord hath showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. 14 So he departed from Elisha, and came to his master, who said to him, What said Elisha to thee? And he answered, He told me that thou shouldest surely recover. 15 And it came to pass on the morrow, that he took a thick cloth, and dipped it in water, and spread it on his face, so that he died, and Hazael reigned in his stead. Here, 1. We may inquire what brought Elisha to Damascus, the chief city of Syria. Was he sent to any but the lost sheep of the house of Israel? It seems he was. Perhaps he went to pay a visit to Naaman his convert, and to confirm him in his choice of the true religion, which was the more needful now because, it should seem, he was not out of his place, for Hazael is supposed to be captain of that host. Either he resigned it, or was turned out of it, because he would not bow, or not bow heartily, in the house of Rimmon. Some think he went to Damascus upon account of the famine, or rather he went thither in obedience to the orders God gave Elijah. 1 Kings 19 verse 15, Go to Damascus to anoint Hazael, thou, or thy successor. 2. We may observe that Benhadad, a great king, rich and mighty, lay sick. No honor, wealth, or power will secure men from the common diseases and disasters of human life. Palaces and thrones lie as open to the arrests of sickness and death as the meanest cottage. 3. We may wonder that the king of Syria, in his sickness, should make Elisha his oracle. 1. Notice was soon brought him that the man of God, for by that title he was well known in Syria since he cured Naaman, had come to Damascus. Verse 7. Never in better time, says Benhadad. Go, and inquire of the Lord by him. In his health he bowed in the house of Rimmon, but now that he is sick he distrusts his idol, and sends to inquire of the God of Israel. Affliction brings those to God who in their prosperity had made light of him. Sometimes sickness opens men's eyes and rectifies their mistakes. This is the more observable one. Because it was not long since a king of Israel had, in his sickness, sent to inquire of the God of Ekron, chapter 1 verse 2, as if there had been no God in Israel. Note, God sometimes fetches to himself that honor from strangers which is denied him and alienated from him by his own professing people. 2. Because it was not long since this Benhadad had sent a great force to treat Elisha as an enemy, chapter 6 verse 14, yet now he courts him as a prophet. Note, among other instances of the change of men's minds by sickness and affliction, this is one, that it often gives them other thoughts of God's ministers, and teaches them to value the counsels and prayers of those whom they had hated and despised. 2. To put an honor upon the prophet. 1. He sends to him, and does not send for him, as if, with the centurion, he thought himself not worthy that the man of God should come under his roof. 2. He sends to him by Hazael, his prime minister of state, and not by a common messenger. It is no disparagement to the greatest of men to attend the prophets of the Lord. Hazael must go and meet him at a place where he had appointed a meeting with his friends. 3. He sends him a noble present, of every good thing of Damascus, as much as loaded 40 camels, verse 9, testifying hereby his affection to the prophet, bidding him welcome to Damascus, and providing for his sustenance while he sojourned there. It is probable that Elisha accepted it. Why should he not, though he refused Naaman's? 4. He orders Hazael to call him his son Benhadad, conforming to the language of Israel, who called the prophets fathers. 5. He puts an honor upon him as one acquainted with the secrets of heaven. When he inquires of him, shall I recover? It is natural to us to desire to know things to come in time, while things to come in eternity are little thought of or inquired after. 4. What passed between Hazael and Elisha is especially remarkable. 1. Elisha answered his inquiry concerning the king, that he might recover. The disease was not mortal, but that he should die another way. Verse 10, not a natural but a violent death. There are many ways out of the world, and sometimes, while men think to avoid one, they fall by another. 2. He looked Hazael in the face with an unusual concern, till he made Hazael blush and himself weep. Verse 11. The man of God could outface the man of war. It was not in Hazael's countenance that Elisha read what he would do, but God did, at this time, reveal it to him, and it fetched tears from his eyes. The more foresight men have, the more grief they are liable to. 3. When Hazael asked him why he wept, he told him what a great deal of mischief he foresaw he would do to the Israel of God. Verse 12, what desolations he would make of their strongholds, and barbarous destruction of their men, women, and children. The sins of Israel provoked God to give them up into the hands of their cruel enemies, yet Elisha wept to think that ever Israelites should be thus abused, for, though he foretold, he did not desire the woeful day. See what havoc war makes, what havoc sin makes, and how the nature of man is changed by the fall, and stripped even of humanity itself. For Hazael was greatly surprised at this prediction. Verse 13, what, says he, is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing? This great thing he looks upon to be, 1. An act of great power, not to be done but by a crowned head. It must be some mighty potentate that can think to prevail thus against Israel, and therefore not I. Many are raised to that dominion which they never thought of, and it often proves to their own hurt. Ecclesiastes 8 verse 9. 2. An act of great barbarity, which could not be done but by one lost to all honor and virtue. Therefore, says he, it is what I shall never find in my heart to be guilty of. Is thy servant a dog, to rend, and tear, and devour? Unless I were a dog, I could not do it. See here. 1. What a bad opinion he had of the sin. He looked upon it to be great wickedness, fitter for a brute, for a beast of prey, to do than a man. Note, it is possible for a wicked man, under the convictions and restraints of natural conscience, to express great abhorrence of a sin, and yet afterwards to be well reconciled to it. 2. What a good opinion he had of himself, how much better than he deserved. He thought it impossible he should do such barbarous things as the prophet foresaw. Note, we are apt to think ourselves sufficiently armed against those sins which yet we are afterwards overcome by, as Peter, Matthew 26 verse 35. 5. In answer to this, Elisha only told him he should be king over Syria, then he would have power to do it, and then he would find in his heart to do it. Honors change men's tempers and manners, and seldom for the better. Thou knowest not what thou wilt do when thou comest to be king, but I tell thee this thou wilt do. Those that are little and low in the world cannot imagine how strong the temptations of power and prosperity are, and, if ever they arrive at them, they will find how deceitful their hearts were, and how much worse than they suspected. 5. What mischief Hazael did to his master hereupon. If he took any occasion to do it, from what Elisha had said, the fault was in him, not in the word. 1. He basely cheated his master, and belied the prophet. Verse 14, he told me thou shouldst certainly recover. This was abominably false. He told him he should die. Verse 10, but he unfairly and unfaithfully concealed that, either because he was loath to put the king out of humor with bad news, or because hereby he might the more effectually carry on that bloody design which he conceived when he was told he should be his successor. The devil ruins men by telling them they shall certainly recover and do well, so rocking them asleep in security, than which nothing is more fatal. This was an injury to the king, who lost the benefit of this warning to prepare for death, and an injury to Elisha, who would be counted a false prophet. 2. He barbarously murdered his master, and so made good the prophet's word. Verse 15. He dipped a thick cloth in cold water, and spread it upon his face, under pretense of cooling and refreshing him, but so that it stopped his breath, and stifled him presently, he being weak, and not able to help himself, or perhaps asleep. Such a bubble is the life of the greatest of men, and so much exposed are princes to violence. Hazael, who was Ben-Hadad's confidant, was his murderer, and some think, was not suspected, nor did the truth ever come out, but by the pen of this inspired historian. We found this haughty monarch, 1 Kings 20. The terror of the mighty in the land of the living, but he goes down slain to the pit with his iniquity upon his bones. Ezekiel 32 verse 27. The reign of Jehoram, 884 BC. 16. And in the 5th year of Joram the son of Ahab king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being then king of Judah, Jehoram the son of Jehoshaphat king of Judah began to reign. 1730, and 2 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. 18. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as did the house of Ahab, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. 19 Yet the Lord would not destroy Judah for David his servant's sake, as he promised him to give him alway a light, and to his children. 20 In his days Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah, and made a king over themselves. 21 So Joram went over to Zair, and all the chariots with him, and he rose by night, and smote the Edomites which compassed him about, and the captains of the chariots, and the people fled into their tents. 22 Yet Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah unto this day. Then Libnah revolted at the same time. 23 And the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? 24 And Joram slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaziah his son reigned in his stead. We have here a brief account of the life and reign of Jehoram, or Joram, one of the worst of the kings of Judah, but the son and successor of Jehoshaphat, one of the best. Note 1. Parents cannot give grace to their children. Many that have themselves been godly have had the grief and shame of seeing those that came forth out of their bowels wicked and vile. Let not the families that are thus afflicted think it strange. 2. If the children of good parents prove wicked, commonly they are worse than others. The unclean spirit brings in 7 others more wicked than himself. Luke 11 verse 26. 3. A nation is sometimes justly punished with the miseries of a bad reign for not improving the blessings and advantages of a good one. Concerning this Jehoram observe. 1. The general idea here given of his wickedness, verse 18 He did as the house of Ahab, and worse he could not do. His character is taken from the bad example he followed, for men are according to the company they converse with and the copies they write after. No mistake is more fatal to young people than a mistake in the choice of those whom they would recommend themselves to and take their measures from, and whose good opinion they value themselves by. Jehoram chose the house of Ahab for his pattern rather than his father's house, and this choice was his ruin. We have a particular account of his wickedness, 2 Chronicles 21, murder, idolatry, persecution, everything that was bad. 2. The occasions of his wickedness. His father was a very good man, and no doubt took care to have him taught the good knowledge of the Lord, but 1. It is certain he did ill to marry him to the daughter of Ahab. No good could come of an alliance with an idolatrous family, but all mischief with such a daughter of such a mother as Athaliah the daughter of Jezebel. The degeneracy of the old world took rise from the unequal yoking of professors with profane. Those that are ill-matched are already half-ruined. 2. I doubt he did not do well to make him king in his own lifetime. It is said here, verse 16, that he began to reign, Jehoshaphat being then king, hereby he gratified his pride, than which nothing is more pernicious to young people, indulged him in his ambition, in hopes to reform him by humoring him, and so brought a curse upon his family, as Eli did, whose sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. Jehoshaphat had made this wicked son of his viceroy once when he went with Ahab to Ramoth-Gilead, from which Jehoshaphat's 17th year, 1 Kings 22 verse 51, is made Jehoram's second, 2 Kings 1 verse 17, but afterwards, in his 22nd year, he made him partner in his government, and thence Joram's 8 years are to be dated, 3 years before his father's death. It has been hurtful to many young men to come too soon to their estates. Samuel got nothing by making his sons judges. 3. The rebukes of Providence which he was under for his wickedness. 1. The Edomites revolted, who had been under the government of the kings of Judah ever since David's time, about 150 years, verse 20. He attempted to reduce them, and gave them a defeat, verse 21, but he could not improve the advantage he had got, so as to recover his dominion over them. Yet Edom revolted, verse 22, and the Edomites were, after this, bitter enemies to the Jews, as appears by the prophecy of Obadiah and Psalm 137 verse 7. Now Isaac's prophecy was fulfilled, that this Esau the elder should serve Jacob the younger, yet in process of time, he should break that yoke from off his neck, Genesis 27 verse 40. 2. Libnah revolted. This was a city in Judah, in the heart of his country, a priest's city. The inhabitants of this city shook off his government because he had forsaken God, and would have compelled them to do so too, 2 Chronicles 21 verses 10 and 11. In order that they might preserve their religion they set up for a free state. Perhaps other cities did the same. 3. His reign was short. God cut him off in the midst of his days, when he was but 40 years old, and had reigned but 8 years. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days. For it the gracious care of providence for the keeping up of the kingdom of Judah, and the house of David, notwithstanding the apostasies and calamities of Jehoram's reign. Verse 19. Yet the Lord would not destroy Judah. He could easily have done it, he might justly have done it, it would have been no loss to him to have done it, yet he would not do it, for David's sake, not for the sake of any merit of his which could challenge this favor to his family as a debt, but for the sake of a promise made to him that he should always have a lamp, that is, a succession of kings from one generation to another, by which his name should be kept bright and illustrious, as a lamp is kept burning by a constant fresh supply of oil, that his family should never be extinct till it terminated in the Messiah, that son of David on whom was to be hung all the glory of his father's house, and in whose everlasting kingdom that promise to David is fulfilled. Psalm 132 verse 17, I have ordained a lamp for my anointed. 5. The conclusion of this impious and inglorious reign, verses 23 and 24. Nothing peculiar is here said of him, but we are told, 2 Chronicles 21 verses 19 and 20, that he died of sore diseases and died without being desired. The reign of Ahaziah, 884 BC. 25. In the 12th year of Joram the son of Ahab king of Israel did Ahaziah the son of Jehoram king of Judah begin to reign. 26. 2 and 20 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri king of Israel. 27. And he walked in the way of the house of Ahab, and did evil in the sight of the Lord, as did the house of Ahab, for he was the son-in-law of the house of Ahab. 28. And he went with Joram the son of Ahab to the war against Hazael king of Syria in Ramoth-Gilead, and the Syrians wounded Joram. 29. And King Joram went back to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds which the Syrians had given him at Ramah, when he fought against Hazael king of Syria. And Ahaziah the son of Jehoram king of Judah went down to see Joram the son of Ahab in Jezreel, because he was sick. As among common persons there are some that we call little men, who make no figure, are little regarded, as less valued, so among kings there are some whom, in comparison with others, we may call little kings. This Ahaziah was one of these. He looks mean in the history, and in God's account vile, because wicked. It is too plain an evidence of the affinity between Jehoshaphat and Ahab that they had the same names in their families at the same time, in which, we may suppose, they designed to complement one another. Ahab had 2 sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram, who reigned successively. Jehoshaphat had a son and grandson named Jehoram and Ahaziah, who, in like manner, reigned successively. Names indeed do not make natures, but it was a bad omen to Jehoshaphat's family to borrow names from Ahab's, or, if he lent the names to that wretched family, he could not communicate with them the devotion of their significations, Ahaziah taking hold of the Lord, and Jehoram the Lord exalted. Ahaziah king of Israel had reigned but 2 years, Ahaziah king of Judah reigned but 1. We are here told that his relation to Ahab's family was the occasion 1. Of his wickedness. Verse 27. He walked in the way of the house of Ahab, that idolatrous bloody house, for his mother was Ahab's daughter. Verse 26. So that he sucked in wickedness with his milk. Partus sequitur ventrem. The child may be expected to resemble the mother. When men choose wives for themselves, they must remember they are choosing mothers for their children, and are concerned to choose accordingly. 2. Of his fall. Joram, his mother's brother, courted him to join with him for the recovery of Ramoth-Gilead, an attempt fatal to Ahab. So it was to Joram his son, for in that expedition he was wounded. Verse 28. And returned to Jezreel to be cured, leaving his army there in possession of the place. Ahaziah likewise returned, but went to Jezreel to see how Jehoram did. Verse 29. Providence so ordered it, that he who had been debauched by the house of Ahab might be cut off with them, when the measure of their iniquity was full, as we shall find in the next chapter. Those who partake with sinners in their sins must expect to partake with them in their plagues.